March 3, 1962, 10:15 a.m. Federal Bureau of Investigation Headquarters. Washington, D.C. The building itself was a monument to power. 10 stories of limestone and granite, sitting just blocks from the Capitol, designed to intimidate, designed to remind every person who entered that the FBI was the ultimate authority in law enforcement in this country. Assistant Director J. Edgar Hoover sat in his office on the 5th floor, in a room that had been designed specifically to make visitors feel small. The furniture was oversized, the desk was massive, mahogany, carved with intricate patterns that took craftsmen months to complete. The windows looked out over the entire city, a reminder that from this office, Hoover could see everything, know everything, control everything. He was reading a thick file folder, stamped with red letters across the front, classified, "Secret Eyes Only." On the cover was a single name written in bold black ink, Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, alias Bumpy Johnson, alias the King of Harlem, alias the man who'd been making Hoover's job infinitely more difficult for the past decade. Hoover's jaw tightened as he read through the pages. 27 years he'd been running the FBI, 27 years of building an institution that answered to no one but him, 27 years of making organized crime synonymous with federal prison, and yet there was one man, one single man in Harlem, New York, who seemed to exist in a bubble of complete untouchability. Laws didn't apply to him. Evidence disappeared. Witnesses recanted. Judges found reasons to dismiss cases. Politicians who should have testified suddenly became unavailable. It was as if Bumpy Johnson had somehow figured out how to exist above the system that Hoover had spent his entire career building. The file contained everything. Documented evidence of numbers, operations running across Harlem, the Bronx, and parts of Brooklyn. Bank records showing millions flowing through accounts that were nominally owned by other people but were actually controlled by Johnson. Photographs of Johnson meeting with known heroin traffickers. Intercepted phone conversations where Johnson discussed protection payments from businesses. Testimony from informants placing Johnson at the center of a criminal empire that generated over $40 million a year in illegal revenue. $40 million. That was the kind of money that could corrupt an entire city. That was the kind of money that could buy governors, senators, judges, cops. And that was the kind of money that Bumpy Johnson had been systematically acquiring and deploying for the past 15 years. Hoover closed the file and looked at the three men sitting across from him. Special Agent Robert Morrison, who'd spent the last 6 years building the case against Johnson. Morrison was 43 years old, 20 years with the Bureau, clean record, brilliant mind for investigation. He had gray at his temples and lines around his eyes that came from too many years of looking at criminal evidence and seeing the worst that human nature could produce. Next to Morrison sat Agent Thomas Wellington, the financial specialist. Wellington was younger, maybe 8, with an incredible ability to follow money through the most complex financial structures. He'd traced Johnson's money through 7 different shell corporations, 2 offshore accounts, and at least a dozen different investment schemes. And beside Wellington was Agent Paul Mitchell, the organized crime expert. Mitchell had spent 15 years studying how organized crime networks operated, how they recruited people, how they maintained loyalty, how they laundered money, how they corrupted institutions. Mitchell understood organized crime better than most law enforcement officials understood their own jobs. These 3 men had spent 6 years assembling this case. 6 years of investigation, surveillance, informant development, financial analysis, and legal preparation. They'd interviewed over 200 witnesses. They'd subpoenaed records from 30 different banks. They'd intercepted thousands of phone calls. They'd conducted raids on more than 40 locations. And they'd built something that should have been airtight. A case that should have resulted in a federal conviction. 25 to life, Bumpy Johnson spending the rest of his days in a federal penitentiary. But Hoover wasn't interested in should have, he was interested in would be. And he had no doubts about what would happen next. "We're going to dismantle everything Bumpy Johnson has built," Hoover said flatly, his voice carrying the kind of certainty that came from absolute power. "Not gradually, not over time. We're going to dismantle it completely, and we're going to do it in the next 8 days. We have documented evidence of illegal gambling operations running across 3 boroughs. We have bank records showing money laundering through at least 7 shell corporations. We have testimony from 4 separate informants, all of whom are willing to testify in federal court. all of whom have direct knowledge of Johnson's operations. We have physical evidence linking Johnson to heroin distribution networks. We have photographs of Johnson meeting with known drug traffickers. We have intercepted communications where Johnson is discussing narcotics transactions. We have documentation that Johnson has paid off at least 18 NYPD officers. We have evidence that 6 city councilmen have received payments from Johnson's organization. We have proof that an assistant district attorney, a man named Marcus Fisher, has been on Johnson's payroll for the past 4 years. And we have something that no prosecutor has ever had before in a case like this. We have absolute proof of the corruption network that supports Johnson's operation. Hoover stood up and walked around his desk. He was not a tall man, maybe 5'8", but he had a presence that made him seem larger. When he moved, the room seemed to contract around him. This case isn't just about organized crime, he continued. This case is about proving that the federal government still has authority in this country, that there are still consequences for operating criminal enterprises, that no man, no matter how clever, no matter how many politicians he's bought, no matter how many cops he's corrupted, can continue operating in defiance of federal law. This case is about showing every two-bit hustler from Boston to Baltimore that the FBI is still the only institution that matters in this country. He paused in front of the window, looking out at the city below. Most people think that organized crime exists because of some fundamental weakness in law enforcement, he said. They think that criminals are smarter than cops. That's wrong. Organized crime exists because the federal government allows it to exist. And it exists because we haven't yet decided that we're willing to pay the price to eliminate it. That changes today. Today, we decide that Bumpy Johnson is no longer tolerated. Today, we decide that his operation ends. Hoover turned back to face the 3 agents. I want a federal indictment filed by the end of the week. I want every asset seized immediately. I want every location that Johnson controls identified and raided simultaneously at 6 a.m. next Monday morning. I want Johnson arrested at 5:47 a.m. on Monday, March 10, 1962, before he can leave his home, before he can contact anyone, before he can mobilize his lawyers, and I want him processed through the federal system in such a way that he cannot make bail, cannot contact the outside, cannot communicate with anyone who might help him. When Johnson is sitting in a federal penitentiary, when his entire operation has been dismantled, when every associate of his has been arrested and charged with conspiracy, when his bank accounts have been frozen and his assets seized, only then will Washington rest easy knowing that organized crime in New York has been effectively neutralized. Hoover walked back to his desk and pressed a button. His secretary appeared immediately. I want this case advanced to the Attorney General. I want a personal briefing with the President's Chief of Staff, and I want congressional notification prepared. This case is going to be the centerpiece of my next report to Congress about federal law enforcement efforts against organized crime. This case will prove that the FBI remains the premier law enforcement agency in this country. This case will ensure that no politician, no criminal, no corrupt official can ever operate outside the reach of federal law. Morrison cleared his throat. Director, I should mention that Johnson has very sophisticated lawyers. Martin Brenner is representing him, and Brenner is one of the best criminal defense attorneys in the city. He has a track record of getting charges dismissed on technicalities. He has relationships with judges. He has connections throughout the city's legal system. What makes you confident that the charges will stick? Hoover smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was the kind of smile that suggested he knew something that Morrison didn't, because we're not fighting in the city's legal system, he said. We're fighting in federal court. Federal judges don't owe favors to city politicians. Federal prosecutors don't need to worry about retaliation from local mob figures. And most importantly, we have something that no local law enforcement agency has ever had. We have the full resources of the federal government. By the time Bumpy Johnson and his lawyer Martin Brenner understand what's happening, it will be too late. The system will already be in motion. The indictment will be filed, the assets will be seized, and Johnson will be in federal custody with no possibility of bail and no avenue of appeal that will get him out before trial. Hoover sat back in his chair. We are going to win this case, not because we're smarter than Bumpy Johnson, not because we have better lawyers. We're going to win because we have power. And power, gentlemen, is something that no criminal can ever match. Bumpy Johnson has money. Bumpy Johnson has political connections. Bumpy Johnson has corrupted cops and judges. But Bumpy Johnson does not have the power of the federal government arrayed against him. And once the federal government decides that a man is going to prison, that man is going to prison. It's only a question of how long it takes to process the paperwork. This case will be the easiest conviction we've ever prosecuted. I'm going to stake my reputation on it. And I wouldn't stake my reputation on something I wasn't absolutely certain about. The three agents left Hoover's office with clear instructions. They had 6 days to finalize the case, 6 days to ensure that every piece of evidence was properly cataloged, 6 days to coordinate with the federal prosecutor, Benjamin Caldwell, who would be presenting the case, 6 days to plan the simultaneous raids that would disable Johnson's entire operation, 6 days that, from Hoover's perspective, should have been enough time, 6 days that Morrison and Wellington and Mitchell felt like they were living in a dream, the kind of dream where everything aligns perfectly and nothing goes wrong. What none of them understood, what nobody in that office in Washington, D.C. could have possibly comprehended, was that Bumpy Johnson had received a phone call that same morning, 2 hours before Hoover called his agents into his office, before Morrison and Wellington and Mitchell even knew that their case was about to move forward. Bumpy Johnson was sitting in his penthouse apartment on 135th Street in Harlem when the telephone on his desk began to ring. The phone was a private line, unlisted, known only to a handful of people who Bumpy trusted absolutely. When Bumpy heard it ring, he knew it was important. Bumpy picked up the phone and said a single word. Yes. The voice on the other end belonged to a man named Marcus Webb, a journalist at the New York Post who'd been covering organized crime and government corruption for 15 years. Marcus Webb was not a man who'd become friends with Bumpy Johnson in the conventional sense. They'd never eaten dinner together. They'd never spent time socializing. But they had a relationship that transcended typical friendship. It was a relationship built on mutual respect, on the understanding that they were both players in a game that required absolute discretion and absolute trust. Marcus, Bumpy said simply, "We have a problem. The federal government is about to move against you. The FBI is building a massive case. J. Edgar Hoover is personally directing the investigation. They're planning to arrest you on Monday morning, March 10th. They're planning to seize all your assets simultaneously. They're planning to charge you with everything from operating numbers, operations, to money laundering, to drug trafficking, to corruption of public officials. This is going to be the biggest organized crime case the federal government has pursued in New York since the Lucky Luciano prosecution in 1936. This is personal for Hoover. He's making it personal." "How do you know this?" Bumpy asked calmly, his voice betraying no emotion whatsoever. "Because I have a source at the Bureau," Webb said. "Someone high up, someone with access to the case files, someone who understands that what Hoover is doing is wrong, and someone who remembers that I wrote the story about federal corruption in Atlantic City. Remember that story? The one that exposed how FBI agents were taking bribes from Atlantic City mobsters? The one that got a U.S. senator thrown in prison? The one that showed the American public that the FBI wasn't infallible? Well, that story also made me some friends in places I didn't expect to have friends. Friends inside the FBI who don't like Hoover? Friends who think someone should know when Hoover is about to move against them? Friends who believe that Hoover has been operating above the law for too long?" Bumpy didn't respond immediately. He was thinking. Webb continued. "My source told me everything. The indictment is being filed by Friday. The asset seizures are planned for Sunday night. The arrests are scheduled for Monday morning at sunrise. 6 agents will come to your apartment at exactly 5:47 a.m. They will have warrants. They will have instructions not to let you contact anyone. They will have prepared statements for the press suggesting that you're the largest organized crime figure in New York. This is not a normal arrest, Bumpy. This is a political execution. This is Hoover trying to prove something to Washington. This is Hoover trying to become even more powerful by destroying you publicly." "Why are you telling me this?" Bumpy asked. Webb took a breath. "Because you paid my medical bills 6 months ago when I had a cancer scare," Webb said quietly. "You didn't know me. I was just a journalist who'd written some stories. You had no reason to help me, but I was facing bankruptcy. The hospital bills were astronomical. The treatments were expensive. And I was going to lose my house. I was going to lose my family's security. And somehow, through channels I still don't fully understand, $50,000 appeared in an account set up in my name. It was anonymous, but I knew it was you. The timing was too perfect. The amount was too precise. You didn't know me. You had no reason to help me, but you did. And I don't forget people who show humanity when they could show cruelty instead. So, consider this payback. Consider this me returning a favor that you extended to me when I needed it most." Bumpy understood then that Webb was telling the absolute truth. Webb was a man of principle. Webb had turned down bribes from mob figures before. Webb had turned down deals that would have made him wealthy. Webb had always written the truth, always exposed corruption regardless of which side it came from. And that meant that when Webb was calling to warn him, when Webb was risking his career and possibly his life by doing so, it was because Webb felt he owed Bumpy a debt that superseded everything else. "Tell me everything," Bumpy said, "and don't leave out any details." For the next 45 minutes, Marcus Webb detailed the entire case that the FBI had built against Bumpy Johnson. He told him about the informants, naming them by their real names and their informant numbers. He told him about the financial analysis that Wellington had conducted. He told him about the documents that had been subpoenaed from banks. He told him about the intercepted phone conversations. He told him about the planned raids. He told him about the timing of the arrest. He told him about Hoover's personal involvement. And, most importantly, he told him about what was driving Hoover. "The thing you need to understand," Webb said, "is that this isn't about organized crime. This is about Hoover's power. Hoover is the director of the FBI because he's convinced Washington that he's essential. That without him, organized crime would run wild. That without him, the federal government would lose control of the country. But Hoover's authority is starting to be questioned. Congress is asking for oversight. The Attorney General is asking questions about Hoover's methods. The President is being advised that Hoover might be concentrating too much power in his hands. So Hoover needs a big case, a huge case, a case that proves he's still essential, a case that shows he can take down the most powerful criminal in America. You're that case, Bumpy. You're the case that's going to restore Hoover's authority and silence all the people who've been questioning whether he's concentrating too much power in his hands." Bumpy was silent for a long moment, thinking through the implications of what Webb was telling him. If what Webb was saying was true, then this case wasn't about justice. This wasn't about law enforcement. This was about politics. This was about power. This was about Hoover using the machinery of the federal government to eliminate a personal enemy in order to solidify his own authority. And if that was true, then the normal defenses wouldn't work. Hiring a good lawyer wouldn't work. Buying influence with politicians wouldn't work. Corrupting judges wouldn't work, because the case wasn't being prosecuted by the normal system. The case was being prosecuted directly by J. Edgar Hoover, the most powerful law enforcement official in America. What would stop him? Bumpy asked. What would make Hoover stand down? Webb laughed, but it wasn't a happy laugh. It was the kind of laugh that came from understanding something fundamental about the world. "Nothing," he said. "Hoover doesn't stand down. That's what makes him so dangerous. He's never backed down from anything in his entire career. He's fought communists, gangsters, civil rights activists, politicians who questioned his authority, journalists who wrote negative stories about him, and he's always won. Hoover doesn't lose. That's his fundamental characteristic. He doesn't accept defeat. He doesn't compromise. He doesn't negotiate. He either dominates or he disappears people. Those are his only two modes of operation." But, Webb continued, there's one thing that terrifies Hoover more than organized crime. One thing that keeps him awake at night. One thing that he spent his entire career trying to hide and suppress. And if that thing came out, if the American public found out the truth, if the media got hold of it, Hoover would have to resign, or he'd face complete destruction. His reputation would be annihilated. His authority would evaporate. The FBI would lose credibility. And everything he's built over the past 30 years would collapse. "What thing?" Bumpy asked. "The question is whether you have access to that information," Webb said. "The question is whether you can find it. And the question is whether you're willing to use it." Bumpy hung up after Webb left him with a single name. A name he said was written in files marked ultra-secret in Hoover's private office. A file that contained evidence of something that Hoover had spent 20 years trying to hide. A file that contained photographs that no one outside of Hoover's immediate circle had ever been permitted to see. A file that, if it became public, would destroy J. Edgar Hoover completely. Bumpy sat in his apartment for 6 hours after that phone call, thinking he didn't make any immediate moves. He didn't call his lawyers. He didn't start moving money out of accounts. He didn't contact his associates to tell them they might need to disappear. He just sat in his penthouse, looking out at Harlem, thinking about what Webb had told him, thinking about what it would mean to move against the federal government, thinking about what it would cost, thinking about whether it was even possible. The thing about Bumpy Johnson that most people didn't understand was that he wasn't a reactive person. He wasn't someone who responded to threats with force. He responded to threats with strategy. He understood that the most dangerous situations were the ones where your opponent thought they had you cornered. Because when your opponent thought they had you cornered, that's when they made mistakes. That's when they got overconfident. That's when they revealed things about themselves that they normally would have kept hidden. What Webb had told him about Hoover was interesting. Webb had told him that Hoover was concentrating power. Webb had told him that Hoover was being questioned by Congress. Webb had told him that the president's advisors were concerned about Hoover's authority. Webb had told him that Hoover needed a big case to silence his critics. And Webb had suggested that there was something Hoover was hiding, something secret, something that, if it became public, would destroy him. The question was, what was Hoover hiding? And the second question was, did Bumpy have any way to access whatever it was that Hoover was hiding? For 3 days, Bumpy made phone calls, not to lawyers, not to the associates who ran his criminal operations, not to the politicians he had on his payroll. Instead, he made calls to people who worked in the most important institutions in America. He made calls to people who had access to information. He made calls to people who understood that information was power, that secrets were dangerous, that sometimes doing the right thing meant exposing truths that powerful people had spent decades hiding. One of those calls reached a man named Richard Harrison, a librarian at the Library of Congress who'd spent 40 years cataloging classified documents. Richard Harrison was 71 years old. He'd worked for the federal government his entire adult life. He'd been responsible for maintaining some of the most sensitive documents that the United States government possessed. He understood security protocols, he understood classification systems, he understood the difference between legitimate secrecy and abuse of power. And he understood that, for the past 20 years, something had been wrong with the way the FBI was handling certain classified materials. Bumpy and Harrison had never met. They'd never spoken before the phone call came through, but they had something in common. Both men believed that power shouldn't be absolute. Both men believed that even the most powerful institutions needed oversight. Both men believed that secrets were meant to be exposed, that transparency was more important than secrecy, that truth was more important than power. Bumpy called him on Thursday night, March 6th, 5 days before his scheduled arrest. Bumpy Johnson called Richard Harrison, a senior librarian at the Library of Congress, and asked him a dangerous question. He told Harrison about secret, highly personal files that J. Edgar Hoover was rumored to keep hidden, and asked whether such files existed, and whether their existence could be proven without exposing their contents. Harrison hesitated, alarmed by how much Bumpy already knew about classified procedures and blocked audits. Bumpy made it clear he wasn't asking Harrison to break the law, but to recognize that Hoover's secrecy went against proper oversight. He argued that documenting denied access and hidden records was not treason, but part of Harrison's duty to preserve an accurate historical record. Faced with the weight of the request and its risks, Harrison ended the call without answering. But half an hour later, he called back, signaling that Bumpy's appeal to truth, accountability, and professional responsibility had reached him. "I can do it," Harrison said when Bumpy answered. "I can create a memo documenting that multiple federal agencies have requested access to certain classified materials in Director Hoover's private archive. I can reference catalog numbers, dates, and agency names. I can make it look like a routine administrative report, something that would be completely unremarkable, something that wouldn't raise any red flags. But I need to tell you something first. I can't provide the actual contents of those files. I don't have access to them. Even if I did have access to them, I wouldn't provide them to you. I have principles. I've spent 40 years upholding those principles. I'm not going to abandon them now, even if you're asking me to. I can only document that the files exist and that they're being hidden from legitimate oversight. That's all I can do. That's all I need," Bumpy said. "I don't need to know what's in the files. I just need to prove that the files exist and that they're being hidden. Everything else, I can figure out from there." Harrison was going to write the memo, but before he did, he wanted to understand one more thing. Why are you doing this? Why are you fighting against the federal government? You're a criminal. You run numbers, operations. You're involved in drug trafficking. You've corrupted public officials. You're exactly the kind of person that law enforcement is supposed to stop, so why are you fighting back instead of just accepting that you're going to prison? Bumpy thought about the question. It was a fair question, and it deserved an honest answer. Because they're doing it wrong, Bumpy said finally. Because Hoover isn't trying to stop crime. Hoover is trying to concentrate power. Because the people of Harlem deserve to know what their government is doing. Because secrets are more dangerous than crimes. Because power without accountability is the greatest threat that a free country faces. I do a lot of things that are wrong, Mr. Harrison. I admit that. I do things that hurt people. I do things that I'm not proud of. But I do those things in the open. Everyone in Harlem knows what I do. Everyone knows that Bumpy Johnson runs numbers operations and takes a cut from drug dealers. That's not a secret. That's just reality. But Hoover is different. Hoover is using the power of the federal government to hide secrets, to maintain control, to prevent people from knowing the truth about what he's doing. And that's worse than what I'm doing. That's corruption of a different kind. That's systemic corruption. That's the kind of corruption that destroys countries. So yes, I'm going to fight back. Because fighting back is the right thing to do, even for a man like me who's done so many wrong things. Harrison listened to Bumpy's answer. And when Bumpy was finished, Harrison said the words that would set everything in motion. Okay, he said, I'll do it. I'll write the memo. I'll create the paper trail. I'll do my job as a librarian and maintain the integrity of the record. But after this is over, if you survive this, if you somehow manage to defeat the federal government, you need to understand something. What you're doing is dangerous. What I'm doing is dangerous. And there will be consequences. There will always be consequences. Just make sure that when the dust settles, you understand what price was paid. On Friday morning, March 8th, 2 days before Bumpy was scheduled to be arrested, Richard Harrison submitted a memo to his supervisor at the Library of Congress. The memo was routine, administrative, the kind of document that passes through libraries thousands of times every single day. Librarians submit memos about access protocols, about document requests, about classification issues, about administrative procedures. Nobody notices these memos. They're filed and they're forgotten. But this memo was different, even though it looked exactly like every other memo that crossed a supervisor's desk. The memo requested clarification on access protocols for certain classified materials that had been referenced in FBI audits but were not available for standard review. The memo listed dates, reference numbers, catalog numbers, and included a note that 3 separate federal agencies, the Department of Justice, the National Security Agency, and the Secret Service, had requested access to these materials over the past 5 years, and those requests had all been denied. The memo also included a note asking why classified materials that multiple federal agencies had requested access to were being maintained in what appeared to be a private archive rather than in the official classified document storage system. The memo was polite, professional, completely unremarkable. It was exactly the kind of memo that a conscientious librarian would write if they noticed something that didn't quite fit the standard procedures. The supervisor filed it. He didn't think anything of it. He didn't understand that this single memo, this innocuous administrative document, was the first domino in a chain of events that would eventually shake the federal government and force the most powerful law enforcement agency in America to reconsider the scope of its authority. But the memo existed. It was part of the official record now. It was in the Library of Congress filing system. Once it was part of the official record, it could be obtained through proper channels. Once it could be obtained through proper channels, it could be presented as evidence. Once it could be presented as evidence, it could be used as leverage. And once there was leverage, everything changed. On the morning before his scheduled arrest, Bumpy Johnson did the one thing no one expected. He walked into a newspaper office. Instead of running or hiding, he went straight to the New York Post to see journalist Marcus Webb. Bumpy arrived with documents proving that FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover was secretly maintaining hidden files and blocking government oversight. He told Webb exactly what to write, a story that exposed Hoover's secrecy and placed it side by side with the FBI's plan to arrest Bumpy. The message was clear: how could the government prosecute a man while its most powerful law enforcement official operated above the law? Webb immediately understood what Bumpy was doing. This wasn't a legal defense. It was a strategic shift that would turn the spotlight away from Bumpy and onto Hoover, creating a political crisis the government couldn't ignore. Before agreeing, Webb questioned the risk. Publishing the story could end his career. Bumpy's answer was simple. Tell the truth. Everything in the documents was real, verifiable, and newsworthy. Webb wasn't helping a criminal, he was doing his job. Webb spent the night verifying every detail. By midnight, all the evidence checked out. Hoover's secret files existed. Access had been denied. Oversight had been blocked. By early morning, the story was written accurate, documented, and devastating. The article ran the next day, asking a question that shook the country. If the FBI director was hiding secrets from the government, what else was he hiding? And with that question, the balance of power shifted. By the start of the week, the story had exploded nationwide. Major newspapers confirmed the existence of the FBI's secret files. Television networks led with the scandal, and Congress demanded answers. What had begun as an investigation into Bumpy Johnson suddenly became an investigation into J. Edgar Hoover himself. On the very morning Bumpy was supposed to be arrested, nothing happened. Instead, his lawyer called to say the case had been suspended and all charges dropped. Bumpy understood immediately. The exposure of Hoover's secrets had forced the federal government to retreat. Behind closed doors, the president ordered Hoover to stand down. Faced with the risk of public hearings and the revelation of his hidden files, Hoover complied. The FBI quietly dropped the case, and media attention shifted from Bumpy to the director who had ruled the Bureau without oversight for decades. What followed was the Hoover Files scandal. Investigations revealed that Hoover had kept illegal personal files on politicians, judges, journalists, and activists, using them to maintain power through intimidation. The scandal reshaped federal oversight, proving how unchecked authority inevitably leads to abuse. Bumpy Johnson walked free and remained in control of Harlem for 6 more years. He had defeated the most powerful law enforcement agency in America without violence, using only information and timing. He understood that people fear losing power more than anything else, and that truth, once revealed, can collapse even the strongest institutions. When Bumpy died in 1968, he left behind a complicated legacy. He was undeniably a criminal, but he was also a master strategist who understood power at its deepest level. He proved that force is not the ultimate weapon, truth is. And once exposed, corruption cannot survive. That was Bumpy Johnson's greatest lesson. Power without accountability is fragile. Secrets are liabilities, and information, used correctly, can defeat empires.